Right, I want to talk now about a number of stories affecting both Jewish people and indeed Israel itself, because there's been a lot happening in the last 24 hours, specifically in Israel. I want to talk about that a little bit later on, but Benny Gantz, who is on the War Cabinet in Israel, has said that he could resign. He is certainly someone who's been very critical of Benjamin Netanyahu and says there has to be a plan to get out of Gaza. I want to talk about that a little bit later on, but I want to talk closer to home with Gary Mond, who is the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly and an expert on Israel matters as well, about these pro-Palestinian marches, because we saw yesterday, again, more consternation, more problems, more issues in regard to the policing of these. And this week there's going to be a big review by John Woodcock, who is Lord Walney. He is the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. And the Metropolitan Police could be given new powers to shut down these protests. And we've had campaigners, including the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, slamming what I call the expensive shambles of policing, and the new plans to amend sections of the Public Order Act are being considered by the Home Office, which allows processions to be banned and public assemblies to be restricted. Let's talk to Gary Mond, chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Gary, presumably you, like me, think this would be a good idea?
Certainly. I think that we need to bring these marches to an end. They've been going on far too long, and indeed action such as this should have been taken months ago. These marches are essentially breeding grounds for anti-Semitism. We see so many slogans, so many posters that essentially make Jews feel fearful. Slogans like "From the river to the sea," which essentially means "No Israel." It's actually a call for getting rid of Jews from Israel. I actually also oppose the massive use of the Palestinian flag, which actually says the same thing. But in all honesty, I think the vast majority of people in the UK would like these marches to be stopped, not just Jews, but non-Jews as well, because they actually undermine our way of life. It's one thing to protest once or twice, certainly, but to go on week after week, month after month with these demonstrations, indeed, there is only one case against stopping them, and that is that the more they happen, the more the British public turn against their cause.
Some people would say, actually, Gary, I mean, I basically agree with you, but some people would say, actually, they're an expression of our way of life. They're an expression of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and actually, those kind of anti-government, sometimes anti-Israeli government protests are actually a manifestation of what a democracy is, and in some ways that's kind of part of the story here, and they should be allowed to continue. Some people will argue. I'm not going to argue that, but let me just put that counterpoint to you.
There's 2 points here. Number one, when does freedom of speech become hate speech?
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that much of the demonstration going on within these marches has turned the cause that they have into hate speech. Many of the people marching actually don't really understand the situation at all. On top of that, and we see quite a substantial Islamist content amongst the protesters too. That's the first point. The second point is, you go back into history, you go back into the early 1980s, we had marches that were even bigger than this for the campaign for nuclear disarmament. They lasted many, many months, but when equally they achieved nothing. So I do think that the key point here is that free speech, all very well, and I'm a great supporter of free speech, but not when it becomes hate speech.
It's interesting what Lord Walney is apparently saying. I hope to speak to him over the next couple of days. I'm going to be presenting Drive between 4 and 7, Monday to Friday. This seems to be, I mean, this report is imminent, but the Home Office has told the Sunday Telegraph the right to protest is a cornerstone of our democracy, but there are clear concerns about the cumulative impact protests are having on some of our communities, which we're looking at. All communities, the Home Office says, should be able to go about their daily lives without fear. We have been clear with the police that they must use all the powers available to them to police protests appropriately, and we'll always have our backing in doing so. I mean, I'm just not that confident that the Metropolitan Police has been using all those powers already. What this report is saying that it should have more powers, and that's fair enough, but actually, surely a lot of the existing powers are there at the moment, Gary, and they're just not being used and not being policed in a way that a lot of people would feel is appropriate and is reasonable.
I think this is an operational issue. And there are certainly many cases of abuse by protesters which should have been dealt with by the police that were not dealt with. One idea that I have would be that when you have a controversial issue such as this and you allow a protest, it should only be allowed a very small number of times, not week after week. And then you have you need to get the protest police much better, with far more police on the ground attending to incidents of either violence or provocative talk, and get it only done once or twice or maybe 3 times at most, and then stop. It becomes illegal beyond that point. Of course, France and Germany don't allow these protests at all.
Well, speaking of France, the French police have actually shot dead an armed suspect who apparently planned to set fire to a synagogue. The Interior Minister said the person was intent on setting fire to a synagogue in Rouen. So clearly there is anti-Semitism not just on these shores, but actual violent anti-Semitism in France there as well.
Well, I think the perpetrator was shot dead. Nobody could accuse the police there of being weak in that regard. What is so interesting here is that the Rouen Jewish community is quite small. It's less than 1,000 people, and whereas the whole of France has got over 500,000 Jews, and I worry about France immensely. But I do think that they're doing the best they can to try to address the situation. Whether this country is another matter. We'll know much more in the next week or two.
How many Jewish people are there in the United Kingdom, Gary? Just a matter of interest.
It's around 270,000.
And in terms of what Lord Walney is going to come out with, what in addition to what's been reported, what would you like him to come out with? If you could kind of wave a magic wand and say to the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption, who I think has been a bit of an ally in all of this to the Jewish community, actually, what do you think he should say?
Number one, as I've said earlier, to stop the marches.
Yes.
Then, but number two, to be much more clear as to what sort of expressions are acceptable and what sort of expressions are not acceptable. I think there is a bit of a grey line, and many of the demonstrators are erring on the wrong side of it. I think a greater degree of clarity in that situation will be helpful.
Okay. But I also want to talk a little bit about Benny Gantz and what has happened in Israel in the last 24 hours or so, because I know you're an expert in that as well. And what we've seen, Gary, is quite a lot of anti-Netanyahu protests. These have happened quite a lot. They're a little bit underreported. We want to make sure that we report the whole gamut of things that are happening right around the world, and especially in Israel. And Benny Gantz, who is on the war cabinet and opposing a politician to the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Tell us what he is saying and why he's saying it, do you think, Gary?
Firstly, I want to mention the underreporting. The underreporting with regard to demonstrations against Netanyahu is from both sides. There is one group, predominantly on the left, who actually believe that Netanyahu needs to be doing far more to get the hostages out. And even if it means letting maybe 10,000 Palestinian terrorists go free from jails, they should be let go, if it means that we have more chance of freeing more hostages. But then there is the opposing group who are also against Netanyahu from the right, who believe that Netanyahu is dithering on going into Rafah, that there needs to be far more determination on the part of Israel to actually finish the job and finish off Hamas. And they too are critical of Netanyahu. And their demonstrations are reported far less in the papers and in the media generally than the demonstrations from those who are against Netanyahu from the left. That's a very important point to note.
Well, tell us more about those. Let's talk about it now, actually, because we have seen, as you say, I mean, I read about it last night. There were lots of, Netanyahu's being in trouble from many sides, really. Just explain those two sides perhaps in a little bit more detail. Maybe start with those on the right, actually, because a lot of people see him as hamstrung by some of his coalition partners wanting to do things but not being able to do them.
I think if I had to guess, I would say the numbers on the right who are unhappy with him are probably greater than the numbers on the left. It's not just Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are the leaders of the more right-wing groups within his government. It's also his own political party, the Likud party, where there are many people who generally are pro-Netanyahu but feel he is not being tough enough. And these people are sort of much quieter. They don't demonstrate as often or as prominently as the left do.
Yes, Gary. I mean, it's really interesting. And actually, from the perspective of those in Israel. I mean, there are so many, especially many of the protesters who were in the streets of London yesterday, who would have us believe that there's this sort of just a single voice in Israel, that everybody thinks the same thing, and that is not the case. It is a very, very complicated democracy.
Yeah.
So
one thing it's on the left, the main left-wing party that's been prominent in the recent past has been Yesh Atid, run by Yair Lapid, the previous prime minister. Lapid took the decision not to join the war cabinet, and his political support has plummeted. And the beneficiary of that has been Benny Gantz.
Who's had a bit of a political renaissance, really. Do you think he could end up as the next Prime Minister of Israel? Because Netanyahu's days are numbered in politics by the look of things, but then never ever underestimate him.
Yes, I think the key issue will be who will be the leader of the Likud party at the next Israeli general election. It may well be that somebody else who might not be such a well-known name now in Israeli politics within the Likud might take the helm and might bring Likud back to power again with a healthy majority once it's formed this coalition with other parties. On the other hand, Netanyahu is unpopular at the moment, and Benny Gantz, most pollsters there make Benny Gantz the favourite to be the next Prime Minister.
Well, we'll continue to...
don't think Benny Gantz is left-wing. He is not left-wing. He's a centrist, maybe slightly right of centre on most political issues.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that, and of course we'll continue reporting what is happening there. It is the most significant foreign affairs story in the world, and it's affecting us here at home as well, because we see those protests and marches. Gary, stay with us just for a second, because I want your reaction to what Mark in Lincolnshire has to say. Mark has given us a call, 0344 499 1000. Mark, what do you make of this plan anyway from Lord Walney, the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption? Is due to be published this week, that new powers could be given to the Metropolitan Police. Do you think that will change things, solve things, help things? What do you think?
Absolutely not. It's a great show, by the way, Peter,
Thank
as
you.
usual. No, I don't think this is necessary whatsoever. They seem to have more than enough powers to shut marches down when they choose to do so. They just do not choose to do so. And the only thing I see, by giving them even greater powers to shut marches down, in particular the Met Police, will happily use them against anybody else other than these people.
Why do you think they're reluctant to use them against pro-Palestinian marchers, Mark?
Absolutely, 100%.
But why? Why are they reluctant?
Sorry?
Why do you think they're reluctant?
To be honest with you, I seriously question. I've had something in my mind, because quite a lot of officers these days are recruited from universities. And I do question whether if they were not wearing their uniform, would they actually be part of that march? If that makes sense. It does,
yeah. So you think they're perhaps sympathetic to it?
I really do question that, because the amount of things that have happened that have been caught on film, some of the banners these people have had, some of the things they've shouted, some of the abuse they've given people, is absolutely unbelievable. And as we've seen time and time again anyway, people on other marches, particularly those that are considered, the elusive far right, they're arrested, they're broken up, they're dismissed within seconds, within any slight hint of anything being untoward.
Well, we certainly saw that on St George's Day. Yeah, we certainly saw that on St George's Day. There are some people acting, apparently, according to the Metropolitan Police, illegally. I haven't seen statistics in regard to arrests or charges that have been brought there. But many people do feel there is two-tier policing here, Mark.
Absolutely. I mean, I would fully agree with that, 100%. And like I say, it just seems to me that these protests, the Palestinian protest thing, is being used as a way of bringing in even stricter rules and, control on the people's right to protest.
Well, that's a very interesting point, Mark, and thank you for your call. I want to put that to Gary just finally before we go to a break. Gary, do you worry that actually liberty will be restricted and those who have perhaps completely legitimate peaceful protests, for example, will actually be curbed by some of the extra powers that could come in? What do you make of that? I mean, we don't know exactly what they are yet, but just in general, Gary.
In general, I'm not that concerned. I think each case needs to be reviewed individually. And we have here a situation with these so-called pro-Palestinian marches. They're happening week after week with tens of thousands, and some would even say hundreds of thousands, people protesting. That is an extreme case compared to the St. George's Day March, which I think, as I was actually not far away from where it was happening, was probably a couple of hundred people happening once.
Yeah.
You know, we have to put things into proportion. And so I don't think that particular point is that much of a concern. I think what's much more of a concern would be stop the marches.